All right, good morning, everyone. So, what I'm going to be doing for our class today is I'm going to do a recording and give some directions for some stuff that I think will be easier for you to go ahead and do on your own. I will have to modify things just a little bit, but I don't think it's going to change things up too much. Right now, I don't have an announcement posted yet, but I'm going to have an announcement that's essentially going to say that I'm going to have you watch this video. You don't have to attend anything during Zoom or anything. And then I do have my office hours later today from 12:30 to 2:30. So if somebody would like to meet with me over Zoom, you can email me and reach out and I'll be available online. But since the college is closed, I'm not going to be on campus. So if anyone has like follow-up questions where maybe you want a little bit of help with the content, or maybe you are wanting to like talk to me about the website that you're wanting to pick, you can always send me an email and we can either email about it or we could set up an appointment and talk over Zoom. So under week 4, we have a PowerPoint that I'm going to go over. It's going to talk about requirements. I had mentioned previously that we're kind of working in the same order that you would as you're going through Agile. So we changed things up a little bit last time with talking about launching versus talking about client onboarding. Requirements is when you're basically gathering all of the documentation that you would need to really understand the scope of what a project is going to cover. And then you would start also gathering information about the client and the users. And so that's kind of where we're at this point is you're learning about those documents and how you would gather everything together. Next time is when we're going to actually start looking at doing a SWOT analysis. And so that's where you need to be sure of which website you want to pick. One thing that you'll notice, depending on when you're watching this, I'm going to have this link for the discussion go live at 9 a.m. And so what you can do is actually go ahead and post which website that you are planning on researching the rest of the semester. I'm going to have this just be first come, first serve. So go ahead and read and see which ones other people have picked. So far, from talking to everyone, I haven't noticed any overlap, so I think it'll be fine. But if you're a little bit worried about it, you could post a backup of something else that you might be interested in, and I can always just kind of help people if two people are interested in doing the same thing. And it's not that I'm worried about plagiarism or anything like that. It's really just so much of these projects you're going to be presenting to the class, and I feel like it just makes it where it's less rewarding if somebody's presented all the information that you have also done a ton of research on, and you basically don't have anything new that you can kind of share to those conversations. So I always feel bad for the person who ends up going second in that case. So just trying to avoid that sort of thing. We are also going to talk a little bit about human computer interaction, just because it is so essential to how we create user experiences, really thinking about how we communicate through technology. So that's going to be something I'm going to have you look at. Normally, we would be watching this video in class. Sorry, there's an ad here. So this video is about 22 minutes long. So I'm going to want you to watch this on your own. And we're going to go through the PowerPoint information first before I would want you to go and watch this. But this is something that I don't think is going to be worth putting in this video just because it's going to be better video quality if you actually watch it in the actual source rather than watching it in a recorded video. So that's something you're going to want to do on your own. I do have some of these other resources that I think are going to be beneficial. So this is a template for how you could gather requirements. I'm not going to make you do an assignment where you have to create a requirements document. This is something that when I have taught the user experience class and students have kind of worked on larger projects, I've had them do a project like this before where You would put your name, the company information, version number, that sort of thing. And then it would just give you an opportunity to go through all of the details of everything that would really be part of this. And this will make more sense when we go through the presentation. This is a sort of thing, though, that I think it's nice for you to download and just keep a copy of if you have like a folder of helpful resources, stuff to just kind of keep around for a rainy day kind of thing. This is something that I think is worth having around. This video, sorry, this video is one that I used to show in class. It's pretty dated by now. Like you can see that it's from 2002. I think that it's really interesting to see what people's perspectives were on kind of the cutting edge technology at the time. Some of the stuff that they're talking about ended up being pretty common day, where now we have that sort of technology all the time. Some of it is stuff that, we didn't actually end up really using because we found other types of technology that we found better tools to use. So it's something that I'm kind of leaning towards more of. It's a nice video to watch. It's a little too outdated now, I think, but I left that under the resources so that way if you wanted to watch it and just kind of think a little bit about that human-centered design. I do think David Keeley is a good speaker for looking at human-centered design, so I like to share his videos, but that one's getting to a point of being kind of outdated. Then for homework, I've got a little bit of reading to go along with the requirements quiz. So a little bit more information on Gantt charts. And over the weeks, we're going to look at burn down charts, burn up charts, Gantt charts, just like ways for you to keep track of your progress as you're working on projects. And so Gantt chart is just another tool that people use for doing that. It makes it easy to keep track of multiple people's progress on projects. And then just kind of how someone might identify issues when you're planning a website project. So things to kind of take into consideration. But when you're doing the quiz, most of the information is really going to be coming from the PowerPoint that we're going to be looking at. All right, so normally I would download this PowerPoint so that way we could actually look at it together in the PowerPoint software. I'm having an issue with trying to authenticate PowerPoint on my home computer. And so I'm just going to be looking at this in Canvas, which I know is going to mess up some of the formatting. So hopefully it's not going to be too difficult to actually look at it in the browser, but that's just kind of why it looks a little bit different. Now, the information that is in this PowerPoint, it's going to look at two different types of documents: website requirements documents, and then statements of work, which are a little bit different. But since the information is coming from an article, it's going to be worded in a way where sometimes it might be referring to us as kind of a audience where we are perhaps the client. So just kind of ignore how the writing is. It's more about the content altogether. All right, so statement of work and requirements document. So here you can see that the wording's kind of looking more at the client side of things. Are you planning to redesign your website, or perhaps you need a new one? Things that you're going to need, though, is a statement of work and a requirements document. And those are going to be things that are going to outline everything that you're going to need in order to build a good communication between you and the client. So here they're going to go through all of the information that you would really need to have in a requirements document, as well as a statement of work. What is an initial statement of work? An initial statement of work gives a high-level overview of a web project. It should outline goals and objectives, budget, deadlines, timescales, and other relevant information, such as audience, target market, and risk. It should also include the personnel responsible for working on and overseeing the project. So a good statement of work should do the following: make clear the objectives of the web project, provide an accurate cost estimate, highlight the projected timescale of the project and completion date, outline any foreseeable issues, and then identify the key audience and understand why they are visiting the site. And so some of this is information that you're going to be gathering over the next couple of weeks. I'm going to have you identify the target audience. That's really something that the client should have an idea of beforehand. When you do eventually do your client onboarding, which is going to be towards the end of the semester, I am going to have you come up with milestones and basically write down your projects and say, like, here's when each of the projects should have been due by. And that's going to kind of fill in for what your time scale looks like. But the time scale is something that you would figure out when you're working with the client and you're having your initial onboarding meeting. You would figure out what their kind of hard deadline is for when they need everything to be done. And then you would be able to work backwards from that, figuring out like what is your team actually capable of doing during that amount of time. All right, so project overview and team information. The first section of the document is an opportunity to outline a basic overview of the project and list the key stakeholders involved. In your overview, focus on the following areas to give the developers and designers a useful introduction to your business and things that you hope to achieve. So that's why when you're doing your research, I'm going to have you start with doing a SWOT analysis on the company. I'm going to have you figure out what the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are that are surrounding their goals and what it is that they're really trying to achieve. But that's something that you really want to have in your documentation, so that way you can make sure that you are always staying on task. So that way when you are working on various aspects of the project, you can realign yourself and make sure that everybody is on the same page. It's very easy to just say like, oh, we're just building a website or we're just doing this multimedia project. But if you don't really know what the point of it is, it's very easy to get off track. So you would want to have an introduction to your company. And like I was saying before, the way this is written is very much geared towards an article towards clients versus an article towards the people who are actually making things. But I think it's actually really helpful to have information on both sides of things. So when we do the client onboarding, I'm going to have you think more about how you're putting together your team's information to give to the client. In this case, though, it's important to have an overview of the company. So what is their history? What's their background? Have they had other things made for them before? Do they have like a certain branding elements that they really need to have? What is their mission statement? What is their vision statement? You know, who are the various contacts that you might need to get a hold of for various aspects, but having them lay out everything, and then you would also want to lay out information about your team as well. Explaining the problem, more importantly, how a new web build will help solve it. So really coming up with your different goals. And that's something when you're doing that SWOT analysis, I'm going to have you come up with what you think the goals are and also come up with key performance indicators. So that way you can actually track to see how somebody would be making progress on those different issues. High-level outline of the project requirements. What do you need from your chosen web development team? A completely new site or a couple of pages redesign? This is something I'm going to have you do in that client onboarding document towards the end of the semester. I'm going to have you fill out a Word document kind of template, and I'm going to have you identify essentially like what pages, but something that you would list. And this is why I have that template document. We can open it back up again in a little bit. But you would want to outline what pages, is there anything that needs to get changed with the information architecture, which is like the sitemap, and what pages you're needing to include in everything. Are there certain features, like are there forms or other sort of like interactive elements to it that you're really needing to take into consideration? Is there going to be like a gallery? But just a clear idea of what exactly is going to need to go into that. Is there anything that is going to end up staying the same? A high level outline of your target audience. So enough information to really get a good sense of who the audience is going to be. We'll talk about the target audience more in, I think it's 2 weeks from now. And I'm going to have you come up with a couple of different personas. We'll talk more about what a persona is, but a persona is essentially a representation of your target audience. And so you would be able to get a clear idea of, okay, here is the target audience. And then when you're designing things, you would make sure that you're referring back to that documentation and making sure, okay, how is this type of person going to feel about this user experience? What are they going to be interested in? Are you actually designing well to what their needs are? Following on from the project overview, it's a good idea to list the stakeholders involved along with their contact details. So just making sure that you have a clear list of information so that way people can know who to contact. Like, let's say that you are needing to get branding information. They should have somebody who is in their marketing area who could help you if you're trying to get maybe content for pages, being able to know who to contact for that. And same thing, vice versa. It would be good for you to list the contact information for the people who are on your team, who would be the individuals that people would need to contact there as well. Goals and objectives. The next step is to outline your goals and objectives. What do you want from your website? What specifically do you want the outcomes of your project to be? This is the most important section of the website requirements document as it communicates to the developers what you want to achieve. Think about the achievements you'd like to attain from a web project or build. So the biggest thing here is making sure, like it says at the bottom, that it needs to be something measurable, specific, and realistic. And so when you do the SWOT analysis next week, I'm going to have you come up with 3 different key performance indicators. We'll talk more about what that is, but they need to be something that is measurable. So let's say that you want more donations, you would want to say specifically, we want to increase donations by, let's say, like 2% over a year. And then you would start brainstorming, okay, well, why are they not getting that number of donations already? What is potentially an issue with the user experience that is keeping people from donating? Is it the fact that the website doesn't seem trustworthy, and so you need to basically make the website look more credible? Is it an issue of it's hard to find the donation button? Maybe it's not advertised in a way that makes it easier to find. But those are things that can help highlight what you really want to focus on in that design. And then you can actually measure to see, okay, well, do you now have more traffic to that donation page? Or are you still having issues with it? And when you're coming up with your goals, and I'll talk about this more next time, but when you're coming up with your goals, I'm not going to give you feedback and say, like, oh, I can't believe you thought that 5% was a good number when really 2% would be more achievable. I'm not going to worry about that sort of thing. I'm going to be more interested in what sort of things make sense for the type of website that you're looking at. If the type of website that you are looking at doesn't do donations, then it doesn't make sense for them to want to measure improvement with donations. If there's other things that they're focused more on, like maybe they are trying to sell stuff, then maybe it's more about getting more traffic to a certain part of their page where that people could actually go and purchase things. So you would want to make sure that your metrics are going to tie to the target audience and what the target audience is really there for and what the client wants them to do as well. Finding that kind of middle ground. All right, so here are some examples. Now, these are still really vague, but we've got things like achieve X% more monthly visitors. Even that is pretty vague. It's better if you say like over a span of time. And that's what we have in the second one. Increase sales of a particular product by X% amount over the next 2 years, boost phone inquiries by X% on a specific service landing page. Now, next week, when we're looking at this further, I do have a link that goes into examples of different key performance indicator metrics. And it's going to give you just so many different examples that you should be able to easily browse through those, get inspired, and kind of pick stuff based off of what you find there instead of just having to come up with stuff on your own from scratch. All right. And so after you've really outlined what it is that the client wants, then you can really think about the target market and your audience. All right. So you understand who your customers, audience, and target market are, but external web developers don't. To ensure objectives are met, outlining who your website is targeting is an essential step in creating an effective website requirements document. So really just this idea of, as web developers, we aren't the experts of these businesses that we're working with. And so really asking them to help give information. And some of this really comes down to that first onboarding meeting where you meet with them and you can ask them questions like, What are some competitors and what do their websites look like? What are like special considerations that need to be taken into account when working with this sort of website? For example, um, I forget if we've talked about the student agency on campus or not, but that's something that I feel like we should talk about in person more. But on campus, we have a student agency where students who have completed 12 credit hours of work can get hired on like a contract basis to help clients in the community build projects like websites and stuff. And so um, I've worked with them before to help students work on some projects. And we had one before where this client was looking for a website that could advertise their company, which basically helps transport patients to their doctor visits. And so, because they were handling patients and there was not specifically like medical information as far as like they weren't treating patients as they were driving them, but there were certain considerations that they needed. Like, for example, if somebody needed to get a ride from a vehicle that could accommodate like a wheelchair, for example, that was something where they needed medical information in order to be able to help facilitate that ride. And so they had like very specific directions for how they needed to collect that information about their target audience, and then being able to include that in a form. So that way, if people were filling out a form trying to see if they could get rides booked for their appointments, they needed to make sure that all of that complied with HIPAA requirements. So it's really important for you to get that information from whoever you're working with, because there could be some sort of security information that you need to make sure gets built in that you might not be an expert on that. They would be the ones who would really understand what those requirements are going to be. And it just changes from project to project on what sort of thing that you need. All right, so as well as outlining your target audience, you should also add information about what the website should do for them. Perhaps you want to improve the user journey to encourage sales. This goes back into really having a clear idea of what your key performance indicators are, but you want to make sure that you document that as much as possible. We'll come back to this idea of creating detailed customer personas, but customer persona, like I was saying before, is you are focusing on your target audience. You are collecting information about that audience, taking that data and basically distilling it down into a kind of a characterization of those um, demographic statistics, and trying to turn those into people. So it's better to have multiples of them. So a good number is like three. So you can get kind of some diversity in the different personas that you have, but they are built off of data that you've collected about the users. And it helps keep people on the same page, because you could say something like, oh, people in like maybe your target audience is people who are like a certain age demographic, like um, maybe people in their 20s or something. So you could make generalizations of, oh, people who are in their 20s are like XYZ and they do this. And but being able to have a very particular person in mind where you can say specifically, okay, this exact kind of person, because there's going to be a lot of diversity even amongst people in their 20s, for example. So you want to make sure that you are really thinking about that person. It's very easy for us to get stuck in our perspective and take for granted how much we know about technology and the process, and forget what something looks like to somebody who's not familiar with it. So it helps us just have more empathy with the people that we're creating things for. All right, so phases and milestones. This would be just kind of breaking things down into different dates where you want to make sure that you have things done by. This ties in as well sometimes to how you might be getting paid. Sometimes you might have a project where you have a payment at the beginning, a payment at the end. You might divide things up where you get paid on a particular schedule, like maybe you get paid every 2 weeks or once a month. It's kind of up to you, and you would want to make sure that you put that in your documentation. But a lot of times people want to have something that is deliverable that goes alongside of that. And you would even want to put into your documentation information like, okay, well, what happens if something comes up and you're not able to actually meet that milestone? And, what would be the agreement on if you would postpone getting payment? If they are wanting to pause a project, what would be your agreement for those milestones? Like, can they also cancel the project partway through? Just kind of having all of that really laid out and having a clear idea of what will be happening at what pace. Now, when you're doing your client onboarding documentation towards the end of the semester, I'm going to make it really easy. I'm just going to have you create a list where it's here's all the assignments from class, here's all the dates that those were due in class. And that would have been essentially your milestones throughout this project. And same thing if you're doing the associate degree and you're doing the capstone class. In the capstone class, you will have set tasks that you are going to do, and then you would create those as your milestones, and you would have an idea of I need to get these things done by these different dates. And it's all just dependent on the size of the team that you're working on, what kind of timeline that you have. I always decide with projects to give myself a soft deadline because there's always testing that you have to do towards the end. There's always like some sort of last minute stuff. And so it takes practice of being able to figure out like what is an achievable timeline and like what are reasonable expectations for your milestones and stuff. But I always recommend giving yourself some sort of good buffer. So it's if you've got a project that's due, trying to give yourself a couple weeks or whatever would be kind of a good amount of buffer. So like for the capstone, for example, I always give people like a 2 week buffer at the end. So that way there's time to work on projects. Or like let's say that you were working on like a big video project or something, like you want to have some sort of like buffer where you're not running right up to the end, especially so that way you can get time for documentation and all of that. All right, so here's just an example of splitting things into different phases. The phases can change. It doesn't have to be exactly these ones, but it's just this idea of what would be key things that would be happening. So like with our class, it would be you're going to have your SWOT analysis, then you're going to work on your personas, and then you are going to do your wireframe and your prototype. You're going to do your testing. Those would be your milestones of different things. Budget. So outline your budget for the project in this section with any constraints listed if appropriate. It's important to be clear on budget from the outset. And there's some things that you can also ask for. So like when I've worked with a student agency before, there's been some clients where they wanted functionality that wasn't, and sorry to kind of be all over the place, but usually the people who are looking for projects through the student agency, they're usually wanting WordPress websites or something that's a content management system. And WordPress does have some things already built in, but there's a lot of additional things that people will want to pay for so that way they can use expanded features. So for example, the basic way to create forms in WordPress is pretty limited, but they can pay more to have some sort of plugin that will allow for them to have more features. Or maybe they want to pay for something that is going to expand what they can do with SEO or that can expand what they can do with something else. So it's good for you to have familiarity with the sort of things that people might ask for and have an idea of what those prices would be. A lot of times with like something like WordPress, there's going to be some sort of like subscription model for that. So I've worked before with some individuals in the student agency where they wanted to have those additional form features. They weren't willing to pay for it yet, but we were able to price things out and basically tell them hey, if this is something that you want to do in the future, this is what it would cost. So that way they could consider it for later. So you want to outline the budget requirements that they are looking for, but then it's also good to give them an idea of other things that they might consider for the future, because you might need to make some compromises with how it's going to work at that moment. And there's been times where people will come back and they'll say, hey, we talked about this before. Maybe they live with the cheap version of it and they realize, this is really a pain and they would like those features. They might come back and they might ask to get those added on later. So just being able to give them that information where they might not have even thought about it before. All right. Another really great thing to consider is the exclusions. So what are things that are not going to be part of the project? So, what is going to happen with the actual content? So, the text, video, media, all of that, they should be providing it. Or if they're wanting stuff created, there should be some sort of conversation about getting somebody to contract and essentially help with that. So, are they going to ask you to work with finding a photographer? Are they going to be finding a photographer? You really don't want to create content for them. You can use stock photos and stuff to kind of act as placeholders. But you'd want to have an idea of what's going to be going on with that content and how are you going to manage it? Where is that content going to live? How are they going to pass it back and forth to you? You want to talk about hosting. So, do they already have a domain? What are the hosting fees? If you are developing the website kind of more locally and then moving it over, what is that going to entail? I was actually working, I think this was with the capstone class. I was working with somebody where they had purchased a GoDaddy hosting. Um, and because they were not able to meet with us in person, they were hoping that we could migrate their website for them. And it ended up being so difficult to migrate it over just because the size that they ended up paying for their hosting was so small that it basically came down to being like impossible for us to try to both have backups saved to the website and then also try to migrate it over. So it's one of those things where it would have been better to actually give them the files and kind of walk them through uploading it themselves. But it's something where they need to make sure that whatever hosting that they have is actually going to be appropriate to the size of the files that they're going to end up with. And they're not just kind of like cutting it really close. So you'd want to talk about hosting. They may or may not really understand. Like you might need to give them some suggestions for like what would be a good host to go with. You want to think about it. Is there any sort of integration that needs to happen with other aspects like social media, for example? Um, they've also got listed here like stock photos, media content, any sort of like branding. I've worked with the student agency. One of the websites that they were doing, they didn't have an online presence, but it was like right at the beginning of the pandemic where they were realizing that a lot of the advertising that they had been doing had been done through brochures. And so they basically were trying to bring in all of the content that they had on flyers and brochures so that way they could make sure that that was included as part of it. So um, you would want to exclude branding, but that's something that they would want to include. So for exclusions, it's kind of what are the things that they are going to be providing and that you are not going to be providing, but it's still something that's essential. Deadlines and timescales, that's going back to those milestones and making sure that you're just having a clear idea of when you're going to move forward. What's the timeline of everything going to be? So all of that is going to be more of the statement of work. So that way you have a very clear idea of like, here is what the focus is going to be. Here's how we make sure that we're on track for everything. And then the requirements document outlines the characteristics, functions, and capabilities of your website and the steps required to complete that build. It should include technical specifications, wireframes, functional preferences, notes on individual design elements. So a good website requirements document should do the following: set out the functional requirements, including the sitemap, design, and user experience. It should have information about maintenance and support requirements when the site is set live. So that's another aspect that I think a lot of times gets neglected, and that's having documentation so people know how to move forward with their website. So if you're creating something for WordPress, for example, usually people are choosing a content management system because it gives them the ability to update it themselves and be able to access those pages again. But if they don't know how those pages work, if they don't know, they haven't been trained on it, it can be really difficult for them to do that. So, what sort of documentation do you have telling them, here's how to edit a page, here's how to add a photo to a page, here's how to update a plugin, all of that. So it should be specific and focused, considered and complete, shouldn't have things missing from it. It should be prioritized with specific information like deadlines. So having a clear idea of the content and site structure. So we can talk about this more when we're back face to face, but having a clear sitemap. So it's really clear what your primary navigation is, secondary navigation, how are your pages actually going to interact with each other, getting a good scope for everything. This is where I wish I could be drawing this out on the board, but a sitemap, you would have your primary navigation. You can think of it like a tree where you have your primary navigation, and then each of those would break down further into more specific categories. So you usually go broad to specific. A good number for your sitemap is your primary navigation to be like 5 to 7 links, and then kind of go further from that. Next would be aligning your taxonomy. And so this is going to be thinking about both the site structure, but then also thinking about your keywords, and that goes into search engine optimization and thinking about, are the words that are being used fitting with the target audience that you have? And are there perhaps better words to use? I like to use the example of um, my husband used to work as a mechanic, but he liked to use the word automotive technician. But if somebody's like going to Google and they're wanting to get the car fixed, they're probably going to type in mechanic. They're probably not going to be typing in automotive technician. So if on your website you might want to use the word automotive technician, it might be the more accurate word or it might sound better, but you want to use words that people are going to recognize and that they're going to actually be looking up. And you can do a bit of a mixture of both. Like you can bring in traffic and then try to get them to use the words that maybe are more appropriate. But it's all about being able to communicate effectively. If you're not communicating effectively with your audience, there's no real point to it. And how you might be writing something for broader audience, like let's say that it's for a website where you're filing taxes. Everybody is filing taxes, and so you want to be able to make it where anyone could go to that page and be able to understand the information and not get overwhelmed by it. You wouldn't want to have that page be very overwhelming. So those are things to consider. I don't think I have it posted this week. Somewhere I think in Canvas, I'm going to have to look this up, but somewhere I have a website link where you can actually check the reading level of content. And it's a really helpful tool where usually, like if it's something where your audience is like everyone, you would want to have your reading level be kind of about the level of a sixth grade reading level, because that's something that's going to be more approachable to a wider audience. If you were going to want to have something for an audience, like let's say that you're making a website for a conference and most of the people there are going to have like PhDs, like you probably would change your writing to be at a higher level, but usually something lower is going to be more appropriate for a broader audience. And then once you would have your wireframes and mockups, you would want to put those documents in your requirements documentation as well. Just get an idea of, okay, what is the functionality going to be? What is that user experience that you're going to be creating? So wireframes, mockups, style guide information, all of that information can go in here. And that gets into this next part of design elements. So is there branding already that goes into this? This would also be a good place to be able to look at competitors and kind of see like what sort of considerations are there for this kind of website, you know, or even looking at the target audience. Is there considerations the target audience needs to have with maybe like having really good contrast to be able to read things? But just thinking about like what specifics does the design need to follow? So some examples of this could be if you have any documentation that already exists, like I was mentioning before with the student agency, there was one of the companies had a bunch of brochures and flyers and stuff that they had handed out on paper. And so they gave the student agency everything that they had, and then they could kind of use that to help them come up with what color palette they should use, what sort of fonts they should use. So any of this would be helpful. All right, so the design work is part of the project. So you'd want to think about brand guidelines. Something else that goes into this as well is having guidelines for the tone of the content. So if there's writing samples, that can also be really beneficial. I like to use the example of my sister's library. So she works at a library, and what they would do before they had a designated person to work on their social media is they would rotate the librarians and basically have each one write articles for their social media. And one of the things that she noticed was that she would write something in a very different tone than how the other librarians would write their articles. It was one of those things that they had to develop because it wasn't something that was one of their normal job requirements. So, when you are doing social media posts and you've got multiple people working on something, or, maybe you're trying to just match something that already exists, it's good to have examples of types of content, whether it's styles of things like visually, colors, fonts, that sort of thing. But then also the tone, like what sort of like vocabulary and kind of messages, like is it lighthearted and funny? Is it something that's kind of more of a serious tone? Like if you think about our college has they try really hard to have like a very even tone across the whole website, so that way it feels like it's all coming from the same place. So that's something else to think about, is it's not all just about the visual aspects, it's also about the writing and how all of that comes across. All right, and then functional and technical specifications. Are there specific things that you need to have for the functionality of how things are going to work? Is it based off of like maybe there's forms or something? Is there some sort of like third party integration? Maybe you need to be able to accept payments on PayPal, for example. But anything that needs to specifically happen, you would want to have documented as well. So these are a few examples of technical specifications that you would want to list. So e-commerce capabilities, multilingual options could be another one. I've seen some websites that students have researched in this class where they wanted to make sure they included that as an option. Social media integration, perhaps, contact or sign up forms, really SSL certification should be all of them. And then thinking about having things be responsive, that's also something that I want everyone to consider. Though I have noticed you've probably heard of the idea of something being mobile first. I feel like some websites have kind of gone the other way, where if it's done with like Wix or WordPress, I feel like a lot of those have gone so far into being mobile friendly that sometimes they're not as desktop friendly. So that would be something to think about, is we're not just looking at mobile first, we're looking at things being well designed so that way they look good on all devices, not just mobile. Non-functional considerations, these next slides are going to be looking at that. So accessibility, thinking about general accessibility considerations, but there could be specific accessibility considerations that go into your target audience. So some things that you might think about, like children, I think is an interesting example. There are going to be certain limitations to things that children can do. For example, I've had students design stuff in the technical interface skills class where it's like, okay, if you're going to design an educational website for somebody who's in first grade, that's going to look very different than somebody who's in fifth grade because the reading level is going to be different, the motor skills are going to be different. And so you would want to think about what your target audience, what would be appropriate essentially for your target audience. Security, are there specific needs for your security, privacy information? You'd want to make sure that that's listed. Any sort of like legal information, for example, there could be different restrictions based off of like what age that somebody is. And then page load speed. This is something that you always really want to think about, but there could be, again, like specific requirements depending on the type of website that you're looking at. Maybe you know that people are going to be looking at things more on mobile devices, and you want to make sure that things are going to load quickly. Hosting, um, this is where you'd want to list any information that you have about hosting and the domain, different considerations there. Having an idea of the different browsers and devices that people are going to be looking at things on, and then maintenance and support. What is this going to look like? Are you going to be training them on how to use the software? Is there going to be follow-up maintenance? Are you going to just kind of work with them on an ongoing basis and just kind of be essentially on call as issues might come up? Having that really clearly outlined, whether it's like following up with them and saying, we're going to do training and just kind of be around for questions, for a month after the website's launched, but making sure that it's clear when would be the end. Like, are you going to keep copies of the website? Are you going to delete backup copies of anything once you've terminated, the service and you're no longer working with them? Giving a clear idea of like what you will and will not do is really important to have. Next, I have this like 20-minute video that is looking at human computer interaction. This, I think, is a really good question of thinking about what does that user experience look like, and just starting to think a little bit more about how we engage with content, because the more that we can think about that, the more we can think about the user experiences. Let me open this again, because I think this is going to make a little bit more sense now that we've gone through that. So as an example of a requirements document, and so you would keep track of which version you're on. So this is essentially your title page. There's room for you to go in and talk about like the background information. And then this, I think, is really helpful, having the specifics. And not every project is going to require all of these things, but it's nice to have these basically written out. So what are different considerations that would need to go into the visitor interaction? What are things that would need to go into editing, updates, administration? What needs to go into the sitemap and navigation? Content management, tracking, search engine, editor interface, accessibility, styling, security, it just goes on and on. Here we've got exclusions, considerations, assumptions, and this, I think, is just a good baseline for everything. So that way you can always go back to this. I do think like when you have the design kind of information down here too, I think that would also be a good place to put like tone in there. And you could have visual things too. Like you could start including some of the style guide information. We haven't talked about this before, but you might have heard of the term like a mood board, something like that. But that would be something where you would document all of that together. So we'll get into this Gantt chart more when we take a look at burn down charts. I just think that this is a helpful to read through and just kind of get an idea of other ways that people will track projects. So talking about those milestones and how you really want to keep track on like, okay, this is going to be done at this set point in time. Gantt charts are a really good way of being able to see like an actual calendar timeline, getting an idea of who is assigned to it, and then being able to keep track of things like the the progress that is being done on things. Like usually you'll have some sort of like color code system to keep track of what type of project something is or how far it is in the completion. Like here you can see there's time tracking happening here, but you can also get an idea of like the time spent on something. A lot of times you'll have it designated towards like a person, which I don't see people documented on this one, but it's just a, or here this one does though. Here we've got like the leaders on it, start date, end date, status, what is the actual program is, and then we have an idea of like how this is actually fitting on the calendar. So a good way of just being able to break down these larger projects and be able to think about it over time. So that's going to be some reading. You can go ahead and start adding your links. I'll take a look at those, and if we've already talked, so I think unless people have like changed which one they're thinking of, you should be fine to go ahead and start doing research on it. But if you're concerned at all, you can reach out to me and I can look at them again. I'll kind of keep my eye on that link over the next week and just kind of see what other ones people are posting. But that really should be it. What I was going to have us do in class is usually I like to break up the class into like two groups and then have people go through the websites and just kind of look at them together. I know that you've looked at your sites and you've shown them to me, but I think it can kind of be nice to look at what other people are also considering because it gives you an idea of what other people might consider to be an issue. Sometimes when you're explaining the website to other people, other individuals can point other things out to you that you might not have considered, and then you could add that to your list of different things that you might want to really look at when you are designing it. So that's something that I really don't feel like it's going to make sense for us to do that through the discussion. So I'm not going to have us do that activity after all. But there's going to be other opportunities for us to take a look at each other's websites in the future. For example, when I have you do the SWOT analysis next week, I'm going to have you do research, and then that's something that I usually will have you present in front of the class and kind of just talk through what website you picked and give us a little bit of background information. So there will be plenty of opportunities for you to see what other people are thinking about doing. But that's essentially how we would be using up the rest of class time, in case you were kind of curious about that. So all you really need to do at this point is put your URL here, so that way I have that documented. I can go back and look at that if I ever need to. And then you're going to have that quiz that's going to go over information in the requirements PowerPoint. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. If you've got any questions, you can reach out to me. I will have my office hours online, and then hopefully I'll have this posted and the directions pretty soon. It might take a little while for it to upload to YouTube and all of that. All right, well, have a good snow day, and I hope everybody stays safe. Be careful if you end up driving.